I'm part of the Privacy Enforcement and Protection Unit in the Attorney General's office. And this is what we do. We enforce privacy laws. We also spend an equal amount of time on educational efforts, both directed toward consumers. We provide people with information and advice on what their rights, what their privacy rights are, but also, and more so, on what strategies they can use to protect themselves in the absence of clear legal rights, which is all too often the case. And we spend a good deal of time working with businesses and encouraging them to understand their legal obligations and also to go beyond their legal obligations and adopt privacy-respectful practices, even where it's not specifically required. And we work with them a lot on that. We follow privacy issues that are emerging and in the legislature and provide the Attorney General with recommendations on how the office ought to get involved in them. We often do get involved. So I want to step back a bit from Marsley's really insightful and helpful look at resiliency and thriving in the digital space and how privacy fits into that, which I thought was fascinating. And just talk briefly about what we mean when we say privacy. So there's two basic definitions that are out there that kind of work. One of them is the right to be let alone. You've heard that from Justice Brandeis, the freedom from intrusion, from government surveillance, that aspect of privacy. And then there's informational privacy, the right to control our personal information, to decide who gets to know what about us, when, and for what purposes. And they've kind of merged in that the intrusions that occur on us, the not letting us alone, tend to take digital form. So a lot of intrusions result in data, and they're made up of data. So this interest in controlling our personal information is kind of a way to look at what we mean by privacy. So the harms that can come from a lack of privacy, from an inability to control our information, from our information going to places we don't know about or that we don't want it to go and being used for purposes that we don't know about or that we don't like, there are many possible harms. There are obvious financial ones like identity theft. There are physical harms like stalking, like medical identity theft, where somebody uses our identity to get medical care and results in getting inaccurate, in relation to us, information into our medical records, which could lead to inappropriate diagnosis and treatment, which could be truly life-threatening. Reputational harm, obviously, we're very much aware of that. Discrimination, if information about us is used to set prices differently for different people, for example, or in employment or insurance, or all sorts of ways that we can be discriminated against. Basic dignitary harms of being surveilled increasingly, and loss of autonomy and loss of freedom. So there are harms to individuals. There are also harms to society, to all of us collectively, when privacy isn't respected. A democratic society depends on autonomous individuals freely choosing to think through problems and work together and resolve problems. And if a lack of privacy has a chilling effect on associations, on expression, leading to a loss of autonomy, our whole society is harmed. So it isn't just a matter of the individual against the many at all. It's an interest that we all share. And privacy also has implications for our children, as you are well aware. I mean, some of the things that can happen to a child, if the child's personal information gets into the wrong hands, are similar to an adult and can be even worse, such as if a child's social security number is used to go out and get credit, child identity theft, which would generally not be discovered for a long time because the child isn't out there applying for credit him or herself for many years. The undoing of that can be very challenging, and it can really impede a child's ability to launch into life as a young adult. In a broader sense, a respect for privacy is essential to human development. It's part of how we become who we are. We have to have a certain amount of privacy in order to thrive as we grow up in life. And then there's student privacy. So now we're talking about student information, the information of students, which can be gathered and amassed and used in new ways through ed tech. It's opportunities to gather information that didn't exist before. We've been aware of student privacy. FERPA has made us aware of student privacy for decades. Technology raises some new privacy concerns. Among them, data breach. The more digital data there is, I don't know if it's true to say the more likely it is to be breached, but it can be breached. We know it can, and it does every day. And the use of student information acquired from students for personalized marketing, for targeted marketing, actually can risk threatening personalized learning by conflating the two. So concerns about student privacy have been felt nationwide. You saw the map of all the states that have been looking at it. We've recently, as I'm sure you know, enacted 2 laws. One of them focused on educators, and then the other one focused on the ed tech industry. And they kind of mesh sort of like this. There's a couple of overlaps, but it certainly isn't like this. And so the mesh creates interesting questions, but also some opportunities to approach both of them in the broadest possible way, looking for the highest common denominator at the points at which they mesh. And indeed, courts might look at it that way. So the first one took effect this year, right? So you're all engaged with that one already and totally in compliance. And I am confident of that. And the other one that applies to the ed tech industry takes effect this coming January. So I'm going to give you an overview of both of them and point to some of the odd little meshing places. And so let me give you my giant caveat, and I'm sure this is going to be a grave disappointment. I am not a lawyer. I am an educator. I'm giving you plenty of opinions, but they aren't legal opinions. They aren't the Attorney General's legal opinions. They aren't anybody's legal opinions. They're my opinions. So if you have questions that are actually legal questions, we will be noting them. We will be looking at them. We don't give legal advice to individuals, but we certainly look for legal conundrums and ways to address them as policy measures. So I'm very interested in hearing your questions as we go through this. So let's look at the first one. I don't know how much you'd want to go through this, because you already know all this, right, on this one? Okay. Perhaps not.
Actually, why don't you walk us through what you're hoping to see?
Okay. All right. So this is the one that applies to local educational agencies. So that means school districts, et cetera. So basically, what it basically says is if an LEA, is that a term you use? Okay, good. I'm used to that. To me, that means a law enforcement agency, but I guess that is not what it means here. If an LEA chooses and is authorized to enter into a contract with a third party that's going to touch student data at all or touch pupil records at all, there are terms that need to be in the contract. So that's the basic gist. It doesn't say you have to enter into such contracts, but if you're going to, it has to have certain terms. And the definition in it of pupil records, that's the term that's used, pupil records. The definition of pupil records is very broad. So it's any information related to the pupil that the LEA retains, and any information that's acquired through the use of ed tech, through the student's use of ed tech. So it kind of gets, it seems to me that that's actually potentially a little specifically broader than FERPA. It definitely includes FERPA's definition and goes a little beyond. Yeah?
Yep, so can I maybe state the way that I'm seeing it, and you can tell me if I'm on
Yeah.
the right track. But so as we work more and more with these what we call cloud-based resources or services, whether it's Google, we use an learning management system in our district called Schoology, that if any of the student work, student data, their record, things that identify them or their work is hosted someplace other than our servers and our little data center that's secured over there, on someone else's server somewhere else, some other company's servers, that 1584 now says, hey, if you're going to do business with that company has to agree to certain things about the protection of that data and the ability for you to get it, retrieve it, delete it from their systems and so forth. That was just this last January, I think, that was implemented. And prior to that, there were teachers and kids, well, I should say prior to that, it may well still be going where there is a lot of these web-based resources where folks are having kids use it, where their data is being hosted somewhere other than our own servers, but there's no official agreement with those third-party companies.
So there's sort of two dimensions about that I wanted to comment on.
Sure.
One is there are two, in this law, there are two categories of the types of third parties with whom you may have a contract that touches data. One is the sort of cloud service providers, as in Bloom would have been, that just store, manage, that sort of administrative use. That's one. The other is software. Sort of ed tech. It's all ed tech, but software like Google School or whatever it's called. Google Classroom. That's it. Google something, or little math apps. But these are the ones with whom the LEA contracts. So there are, I suspect, look, we're looking at this law right now. There are categories, especially here in this box, where the school may not have a contract, and yet a teacher may assign.
I think that's been the struggle a little bit, is figuring out what constitutes a quote-unquote contract. The two parts of this law that are challenging is what is really that broad category of a pupil record, and what is that broad definition of a contract. And I know in our regional and tech meetings, that's the real trip up for everyone. You said, we know these laws and we're comfortable with them and that sort of thing. And the truth of the matter is, we're aware of them. And I think most of us are like, we should probably do something about that. But feeling very like it's an impossible thing to try to solve, in the sense of, what are these records? What are these contracts, from creating the policies, and then as we've talked about, especially in a large district like San Juan, you can have all the policies you want in the world, but how do we really support practices in the classrooms that are sustainable, with everything from educating the teachers to really have systems in place that maybe prevent them from accessing certain resources, or really directing them to the resources you want them to use.
So on the pupil records, what are pupil records? I think if you look at the definition here, you're going to be best off interpreting it very broadly. Right. Just interpret it the most broad way possible, and don't look for opportunities to, well, maybe we could slither out over here. Yeah. So that may not be as much of a
one of the frustration points, partly talking to companies and looking not just in California, but also at the federal and other state laws, and some of their frustration is that each law, COPPA and FERPA already, and then some of the new laws, basically has a different list of what is either pupil record or personally identifiable information. I would say the best response for those companies or you is, as Joan said, think as broadly as possible.
Well, and the definition here, there's the two boxes. One is any information the LEA maintains that is directly related to a pupil. So that's a lot, right? I mean, I guess it's not de-identified stuff, but that, I don't know, that seems like a big enough box itself. Then the other is, and anything that is acquired through the use of software. So what would be outside of those two boxes that you would have? Yeah.
So So we have a provider that actually, I guess they consider themselves not a provider, but it's a hosted student information system. They said, we have the database, you put the information in, you pull it out, we don't touch it. And their claim is, it doesn't apply to us. It seems to me that that's kind of a gray area, and it really
So
does.
do you have a contract with them?
We do have a contract with them.
So it has,
Yeah. Well, I was beating them up and they were beating me back, so, but our legal team doesn't seem to, it's so new that they didn't really know how to respond to all this.
And we're hearing that pushback in a lot of places, and that's why we're working with some law firms to try and develop more standardized positions for you at the district to have, so that it's more clear what you're insisting that that the companies provide. But that's not a new strategy. There are a number of companies that have approached this by saying, we're hosting it, but you still own it. Part of the reason they've done that all along is that FERPA also has always required, and now more challenging in a digital way, it requires parent access to all of those educational records. So if a parent, and this is a way, sometimes I have a conversation with an ed tech company and point that out to them, and they go, whoa, wait a minute. So a parent could come to you at the district and say, I want all of my students' educational record so that I can review it and correct it. And that's already required under FERPA. And so what the companies in some cases are trying to do is say, well, yeah, great, but that's between you and that's between you at the district and the parent. We don't respond to those parent requests, and those will have to come through you. But we are trying to help clarify with some legal help, some basic guide rules that will help you at the district streamline some of the expectations here. Because right now there's a whole lot of, what does this exactly mean?
and so there's still this little, in the scheme of this statute, there's still this little group of probably this more than that, with which the LEA does not have a contract, but teachers are assigning it. And that gets in here in the definition of pupil records, any information acquired from assigned by a teacher, a whatever, but it's the contract is the root. So it's the other law that speaks to those, the free things, So it's the other law that speaks to those. So we'll move along on that one. So here's.
So just to clarify
Yeah.
what you're saying, though, I mean, if you're an LEA and you're concerned about this, really what you're looking at are the resources. Are the resources for which you have quote unquote signed a contract at an LEA level. You're not worrying, and this for the purposes of this law, about the, as you described them, the free things.
And
the teachers
the
are
question
assigning.
is, which has come up, and we're kind of looking at it, does the terms of use of those things constitute a contract with the LEA? So.
Right, because very often when those teachers have their kids start using some free resource, there's a little thing where they have to click accept or agree.
Just press the blue button. Don't
Just
worry
press-
about it.
yeah, don't bother reading this. That's kind of a
See, now those,
contract, right?
those,
Let me let her off the hook for a second, because neither one of us are lawyers, but at the SIAA conference, the software industry conference that was in San Francisco in June, when we talked about this, there was a panel of two lawyers, one who works with California school districts and one who works more with the ed tech companies, and they were addressing this exact question. Does an app clicked on, the terms of service clicked on by a teacher, does that qualify as a contract with the LEA? And the lawyer representing the ed tech companies and apps and others said, that's a good argument. There are a lot of people who say that it probably does. The lawyer representing the districts in California said it absolutely does not.
so there we are. Nevertheless, the other law still reaches those things. They have obligations under the other law, which are similar to what's being gotten at here. It's the other side.
So I think everyone in this room, we recognize that you're not attorneys. We're not seeking legal advice from you. But to go back to your original statement about, we know this law and it's been implemented, this is why we're all sort of in this holding pattern right now. Is that, when you were coming up with policies and procedures for your LEA, it's really tough when we're still kind of debating what's the pupil record, what's the contract. And so, as you're talking to the Attorney General or to legislative folks, that's some areas where I think we as educators need some clarity in order to make this, we're talking about this thriving in this environment. In order for an environment to thrive, we have to have very concrete resources that we can work
Well,
with.
let's look at the other law. Think about that point again when we look at the other law, and I'll tell you some work we're doing on that. So back to the contract. So there are things where you do have contracts. So this is what has to be in the contract. That first one is critical. That the contract says this data is the property of the LEA. It is not the property of the service provider or the software company, whatever, is the property of the LEA. That triggers some obligations under the other law, as we will see. Pupils have to, there's all sorts of software in which kids are writing stuff, and the contracts has to say, here's how the students, the pupils, can get access to their own pupil-generated data and control it. There has to be a way. The company can't hold it hostage. The third party, that is the party to the contract, can't use it for any purposes other than the purposes specified in the contract. There have to be procedures for the parent, guardian, eligible pupil over 18 to review and correct his or her information. So that's kind of FERPA through this contract. There has to be a general description, I'm saying the word general, of the third party, the contracting company, of the security measures they're using to protect the confidentiality of the information. I guess you can have these slides, right?
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
they said they'll be sharing this after. I didn't want to interrupt, but
Yeah.
we'll be sharing the slides after.
It specifically says that there has to be in the contract a description of the procedures for notifying in the case of a breach of that data. And in the previous one, as well as this one, the previous one says that the security measures, even with security measures described, if there's a data breach, the company's still liable, even if they have described security measures. So if notify of a data breach. Yeah.
So if we're talking about directory information, so this doesn't really apply? So if the students are just putting in their first and last and email address, and the email is part of your directory information, then this doesn't apply, is that true?
The breach notification law, it doesn't apply under the Civil Code breach notification law, which applies to school districts. The language here isn't exactly data breach. The language here is an unauthorized disclosure of pupil records. That's broader than the data breach law. So maybe that would mean a disclosure beyond whatever the contract says. But the data breach law, it has only certain types of information that require notification. This is broader. A disclosure, an unauthorized disclosure of pupil records. So potentially it would include those. Yeah.
In your previous slide, you talked about the students having control over their generated material. Does that include assessment data? Or is that just material that they have produced creatively?
I think it means the latter. I think that's the intention. If you read the committee analyses, that's what they're talking about. Because assessment data is about the students, and in a sense they created in that they do what's being assessed, but I don't think that's what it means. I'm not a legal opinion.
That's what we thought we did, Joe.
Good. I look at you periodically. She is a lawyer. And on one of the legislative committees that these bills went through. Yes, that when the contract term is over, or the contract is terminated, or whatever, The records have to be, are not to stay in the control of the third party. They have to go back to the LEA. And it allows, I can imagine how this little provision came into the law. Pupils may want to, and they're allowed to maintain an account with a third party, even after the school no longer has a contractual relationship. And that has to be spelled out in the contract. How the LEA and third party will jointly ensure compliance with FERPA. I don't know how detailed that would have to be. You know, the access is a piece of it and so on. And saying that specifically, this is a place where it meshes with the other law, that the third party can't use personally identifiable information, that is the language that's used here, for targeted advertising. So it can't use personally identified information on the pupil for targeted advertising. That kind of meshes with the other law. The other law has a broader, more types of information that couldn't be used for targeted advertising. So the enforcement regime is interesting. If either party is not in compliance upon a notice and an opportunity to correct, the contract may be voided. I don't know exactly who does what to make that happen, but either party can do it. And then the records have to stay with the LEA if the contract is voided. It says, in addition to any other remedies that may be available. And there's the definition of pupil records. So that's the gist of that. There are other definitions in there of what third party is and about de-identified and stuff, but I won't go into that right now. So now let's look at the industry side. So this one applies to ed tech companies, to companies that provide, that have products that are designed and marketed for K-12 school purposes. Designed and marketed for K-12 school purposes. And basically it says they can only use any information they collect through those products and services for K-12 educational purposes, school purposes, and we'll look at what they are. So it basically, they can't be using it for other purposes. That's the whole point. So here's what it says. Websites and online services designed and marketed for K-12 school purposes, and it includes things like the cloud providers of data hosts, like apps, like websites for homework, all that stuff. And they're prohibited from doing these things. They can't use the student information collected for targeted marketing, targeted advertising, so they can't advertise back to the kids either through the app or any place else they might be advertising to the kids based on the information that they collect through those services, software. They can't use it to profile students except for K-12 school purposes. So there could be some profiling for K-12 school purposes. That's kind of part of what would be going on in personalized learning. You are profiling. They can't sell student information. The exceptions are merger or acquisition. But in that case, the successor has to continue to abide by this law. So they still can only, they can only use it for K-12 school purposes. They can't disclose it with certain exceptions to improve the functionality in the classroom or the school if it's legally required, to serve to a service provider if necessary, a service provider to the operator that's subject to this, but only for the operator's purpose and with no onward transfer. So it stops right there. It can't go for anything else to improve the operator site or service, to the local agency, or for school purposes as permitted by law. So basically, it keeps it in control of the school. Yeah.
One of the things I've been interested in is this whole world of big data, where there's massive background collection of data that's not related to these specific vendors' of third-party apps for schools. But one of these background data points is IP addresses of the computers that kids are using. And my question is a student's IP address considered part of student data?
In this law, yes.
When it doesn't emanate from school. So that if a student logs on the web, the interwebs know where this kid is, but then the kid goes on to browse at various sites, and so there's background data being collected that's not related to the app. I'm just wondering where the walls really are.
It can only be used, student information collected through the site or service, only used for K-12 school purposes.
But is that IP address part of that information?
It would, I can't say specifically, but let's look at the definitions. That's why I went to grab this.
It's just that what I've read is a lot of this big data is based not on anything that's education related. It's
Right.
all just background.
Yeah, and that's certainly the intent. That's certainly the intent because that's critical for targeted advertising and profiling. So that is absolutely the intent, that it could not be used, that would be included and couldn't be used like to advertise to you over here when you're doing something else. And this company is doing covered information, personally identifiable information or materials in any media format. I think we would be, I would certainly assert that if I were you. Because that's what permits that target advertising. So there are prohibitions and then there are requirements. So the operators of these sites, services, et cetera, have to use reasonable security, blah, 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 and have to delete the information if the school or district requests. And here's where it links to the other law. It says if the information is in the control of the school or district, the other law says if we have a contract going here, that the school is the owner and controller of the data. So for the ones for which there's a contract, absolutely, and that's a big deal. That the LEA is the way that it would work as it meshes with the other law. Could have it deleted. It allows disclosure of the information for legitimate research purposes, and that defines that as it's required by law and subject to the law, or it's allowed by the law and under the direction of the educational authorities, and it's not used for advertising or profiling. And de-identified information is one of the ways that it can be used for research. And while there's no definition of de-identified here, I would think looking at FERPA's guidance on de-identification of student data is probably a good place to go. They are allowed to use it to improve their own products and services, et cetera. De-identified. So here's the definition of covered information. Personally identifiable information or materials in any media or format that meets any of the following. It's created or provided by the student, the parent, legal guardian, through the use of the site, blah, blah, application, et cetera. It's created or provided by employee or agent of the K-12 school, district, LEA, or county office of education to an operator. It's gathered by the operator, oh, here we go, through the operation of a site, service, or application, blah, blah, blah. Descriptive of the student, including but not limited to first name, last name, home address, food, blah, blah. Student identifier, search activity, photos, voice recordings, so it doesn't specifically say IP or device ID.
So Bill, to your point is whether IP address is ultimately determined to be personally identifiable in some way to the individual, and I think that's going to be a conversation that's probably going to evolve and still occur over time, right?
But since this law says the operator, the company, can't use it for anything but K-12 school purposes, they can't use information for anything, and in some places it says covered information, in some places it says student information, which is broader. And our advice to them is think broad. Think broad. So that's the purpose of them wanting to do something with the IP address. So while it may not be explicitly included in the definition, it seems like it's covered in the prohibitions effectively.
Can't be cynical, but it seems to me that even an ISP knows where the traffic is and knows when Johnny is logged into Schoology, and then Johnny logs off of Schoology and
Yeah.
heads for the internet.
Yeah.
And so there's already a kid there. The ISP knows there's a kid there and tracking kid, and all of this data is being compiled. And there's education thinkers out there saying that we can do away with standardized testing just by analyzing the browsing habits of Johnny. And there's nothing in this law that tells me that there's a way to disconnect the use of a student application from their habits on the internet. It's all one kid.
There's good reason for cynicism on that, and to go back to background, just from a policy geek perspective, that's sort of what COPPA was always designed to do at the federal level, just for kids under 13, in school, out of school, anywhere. You as a company, thou shalt not collect, use anything with their personal information
That they
without
provide,
their parents' permission.
That they provide. They can't collect it from the kid.
And when the FTC broadened the COPPA rules, they added more conditions and clarified that apps obviously come under COPPA.
And that IP address under
Right,
COPPA.
and that IP addresses are included. But to your point, that was more broadly about all data for younger kids, not educational versus otherwise. What the new approaches to FERPA, the amendments that are being discussed in Washington, and I think SOPIPA kind of reverse engineers FERPA, but applies only to the school space. And you're getting at one of the real challenges that's still going to be wrestled over, I think, which is how much of this is educational data and how much of this is just data about 14-year-olds who obviously are also students.
But this is saying that these companies, whether or not they're under contract with you, the one that are providing these software and services that are marketed and directed for K-12 school purposes, that they can't use them for profiling, period, or for targeted advertising, except for K-12, profiling for K-12 school purposes. We'll look at the definition of K-12 school purposes. There it is. By golly. Notice, and it explicitly says, instruction in classroom or at home. So this, includes homework stuff. And this is an issue that the industry think, this doesn't really mean that, does it? It says it, literally. So it's the purposes that customarily take place at direction of school, teacher, or district. So this definitely authorized uses. This definitely does cover the apps that teachers may assign that are not contractually related to the LEA, but the teacher is assigning them. And we know from meetings we've had with educators that even in districts where they have a list of approved apps, sometimes teachers find other apps that they think would do a better educational job and maybe using ones that are not on the list. I think, and we heard over and over at those meetings that districts would like guidance and help in identifying apps that should be approved that meet educational objectives and legal objectives regarding data handling. So I know that there's some work being done by a number of organizations, including iKeepSafe, to rate apps from the privacy legal perspective. And it's still there's still the which ones are going to be the most effective from an educational perspective that needs to come out of the educational community. All the people with spare time to be doing that. I know there are lots of them. So, we have been working on a project like we have done on other issues, to make recommendations to the industry. We're talking about the tech industry here, the ed tech industry, of what is the sort of high-level best practices way to protect student privacy. Certainly consistent with SOPIPA, but it's even a higher standard. So one of the things that we're addressing in our draft of this is to build in. So for a number of reasons and other laws, most of these ed tech apps and things are already required to have a privacy policy. So we're building into our recommendations, best practice recommendations of what should be included in that privacy policy, the mirror image of the contract terms required by the other law, to make them explicit in the privacy policy so that it'll be more helpful to districts to see what's going on there, and creates another buttress to a requirement. So that's a recommendation. That's not required by the law. There are certain things that are required to be in the privacy policy, but we're going to go beyond that in these recommendations. And we're also going to be recommending that these operators of these kinds of apps and services treat all student data as if it's covered data. Anything that comes to them about the students through their things, that they should treat it all as covered, even though some provisions say student data in the law, some say covered data. As Marcely said so well, you know, we don't want to cut off opportunities that ed tech provides for improving school operations and learning and making it more interesting and exciting and valuable for students. And at the same time, we think it's absolutely essential that the students be protected from inappropriate uses of their information by these companies, uses that can even subvert their educational value, as well as just be a generally bad idea. Let's see. I guess that was it. If you have any more questions, I have no idea where we are on time. Sarah, who is also in the privacy unit, has been writing down questions and comments to take back.
I have a question. Really quickly, in the federal space around this law, there's around COPPA, there's safe harbors. Has the Attorney General considered providing a safe harbor type of experience for industry so that educators and industry have that communication and a little bit of?
Well, in a sense, the best practices guides that we provide might be viewed that way by industry. So we have a best practices guide that we developed a couple of years ago on mobile apps called Privacy on the Go. And it makes recommendations to many players in the mobile ecosystem, but in some detail to app developers. And we recommend things that are beyond what the law requires, but certainly that are not inconsistent with what the law requires. When we produce one of these recommended practice guides, it tends to get a lot of play in the legal blog space as practice advice, so it sort of gets out there, but it's not binding. You know, it is best practices. So this could be viewed that way by tech companies. We would hope it would be.
Joan, I think there's a couple of initiatives out there that I think would be very helpful if whatever nonprofits are continuing to pursue this, in terms of some sort of badging or certification system for your various educational resources. So as a teacher, you're going to have a really difficult time understanding and remembering and really internalizing these laws. But if you could go to a resource and, I really want to use this with my kids because it's cool and I think they can get excited by it, and you see a little badge that says SOPIPA compliant, FERPA compliant, AB 15, whatever it is.
Hearing about that very quickly.
Right. So those are the types of things, if we can get more vendors, more resources, so that they just say, hey, look, we've got all these badges. It makes it easier for folks at the ed tech level or technology, services level to say, yeah, we will open that resource up for you. We'll make it available. Right now, we get requests all the time. And it's like, wow, wait a minute. Well, do we know if we open that up, is that student data going to go onto this site?
Yeah.
Does that create any liabilities? And just the time and effort to really research all that can be very onerous. So some sort of system like that, I think, is tremendous value for
And we
educators.
want, in our best practices, we want to make that more possible by making these recommendations about what should be in the privacy policy, and to make it easy for a district to post, on the web, like a list of here's all the approved software and here's a link to their privacy policy, so that parents can see just what it is, as well as useful in developing your contract terms. And I've got to say, because you're going to get some very good information from iKeepSafe, that there are also other nonprofits that are working on the same kind of evaluation and badging from a privacy and security perspective. It still remains to get evaluation from an educational perspective, which I guess is probably pretty important.
And so from your office, are you, at your level, are you partnering or participating to maybe try to wrangle that in and get a uniform?
No. No, we're not. That's not quite the role that we would get into. So we're speaking to the business side on this. There's a whole bureaucracy to speak to the education side, as I understand. Does anybody here know, is the State Department of Ed doing anything in relation to the new laws?
We'll keep working on them on that, but not yet.
Maybe I could do a quick summary of where iKeepSafe is with the badge while we've got Joan here and ask some questions. So we saw this coming, now it's been almost 2 years ago, that the pressure for high access educators who want a lot of opportunities with digital data to be able to determine actually where is that data going. And we watched this as the mobile devices became more ubiquitous, and then particularly with bring your own device. Because we'd go into a company, we'd go, because we have various sponsors, and we'd go into a school and I'd always ask, okay, how are you doing finding your software and applications? You feel comfortable picking the products that help you be compliant with the laws that you need and protect and all the safety features? And they're all, I heard this so many times, oh, there's 3 of us in the district office and we're trying so hard, but we're not experts and we don't really know. So we could see, this was going to be a bottleneck for educators. So that's why iKeepSafe, we applied for a safe harbor for the FTC's COPPA, because we wanted to create a high bar of expectations. And then we launched a FERPA badge just, within this last year. And it's not out formally, but we are doing a California school data privacy assessment so that we can take the recommendations that we're getting from the law firms like F3 that are looking at contracts and make sure that you know where your data goes. So when you do an actual assessment, so if you're going to look and see where is the data going, you have to do a manual and a technical review. So if you only look at the privacy policies, you really don't know for sure, because sometimes, the third parties are just, when people used to build software in their own servers, and they all sat in various spaces with servers. But then with the cloud and opportunities that are actually quite secure, so clouds are a great place to go, you actually can gather some really great software that plugs and plays with yours. And it's those places where they plug and play with yours for efficiency gains or analytics, or there's a lot of good reasons to use third parties. But until you've done an actual technical review, meaning you put it into a test where you can see the data flows, you don't really know if the privacy policy lines up with the practices. So we want to do that homework for schools. So as a nonprofit, we don't have any corporate partners on our board of directors, so we only answer to ourselves and what we think kids need and schools need. So we've been in this space, for 10 years. So our whole total reason to do this is so that schools don't have to do the homework district by district by district on all the 3,000 or 5,000 products. So we'll go in and we do a manual review. We look at the privacy policy. We ask the questions that are asked in SOPIPA and the contract law questions, and we put them together on a product profile. And then we do a data map, and it goes to a piece of software that actually maps out so that by the time we're done with it, we can give it a badge that says it meets iKeepSafe's expectations around California data student privacy laws. And then that product profile you can have access to so that every district doesn't start from zero with every piece. So the industry pays for the assessment, and it's minimal compared to all the other audits and assessments they do. It's like so low, people go, Marcy, really seriously? But we wanted to make sure that every product could do it. So every year, it's at least mandatory, they have to have another reassessment. So it gives you assurance that somebody's reviewed their privacy policy, it meets a set of best practice expectations, and then it went the next level is the data map to ensure that the policy reflects what's actually happening. To do a quality assessment is 40+ hours per product. Per product. So for you to really know where that app sends your data, it's going to be about 40+ hours per product. So to be able to for education for districts and counties to do that individually across the country just makes no sense. So that's why I see a real value. Now, we do the assessments under NDA because we want industry to see this as a productive way to work with educators. We don't have a bad list. Like, we're not going to throw anybody under the bus, and we don't list any bad education practices either. So we hear all about what goes on actually with data and oopsies and whoops and all that teacher when we didn't know, because that's usually how problems happen. So our role is to help people be able to be better and do better and have better transparency. So by the time if every school district has to do 40+ hours per app, it's crazy. So we work with the industry under NDA. They say, okay, you can look under the hood. They're not too excited about it, but we're going to let you look under the hood. Under NDA, we look at it. If there's any things that we think need to be improved around safety and privacy, we work with them quietly, and then we give them the badge. So we don't have a list of people who start and how long it takes, because there's all sorts of things in a developer's timeline that impact that. So it's a way for you to know where your actual data goes. What's NDA? A non-disclosure agreement. So it means that they don't have to worry we're going to get in and go, oh my stars, do you know what they're doing? Which if you were to do a data map on just random products, you might find a couple of those and go, oh, wow. And we've never found a malicious developer that says, we've just created the software to absolutely gather up every piece of information, because we have this company who wants to know all the 3rd grade level reading scores. So in 10 years, we only want to employ those people, because we know the direct correlation between 3rd grade reading scores and success in the workforce. Like, it is, it's serious. So we don't want to have, anyway, we have found the vendors to absolutely want to know. And the challenge for vendors, when privacy laws started in the United States, it's sectorial. They go by groups. So the first group to lose the most money from the web would be what? So we know already, you connect the superhighways, there's crime. What's the most valuable thing out there? Financial services. So they have big bucks. They come to the table and they say, okay, we need a set of expectations because my bank accounts are getting hacked and my brokerage is now hacked. So they're motivated. They have money. They represent each other at Congress, and they're busy making money, so this is a big deal for them. The next sector that came together would be medical. Because big data, medical records, mandatory digitized records. But really, the most valuable and the most broad-based amounts of data sets come from where? Children. Look at the amount of information. My school knows, custodial parent, I'm divorced, who's a custodial parent, how much money I make, I had to show my mortgage for my Arlington address. Now I'm in Santa Clara County. I had to show them my rental agreement. They know so much about, they know what my daughter eats at school. They know when she goes, when she doesn't. They know what classes she takes. They know all of her grades. They know what she's doing after school. They know her interests. They know the projects that are digitized. I mean, they know so much. Santa Clara knows so much about my children. But do educators have big bucks and a lot of time to sit around and work out negotiate how we're going to manage best practices? What are you doing? You're teaching. You're working on the technology. So this is why we haven't had that same sort of evolution in the education community, is because you are busy educating. But meanwhile, the data world and the digital superhighways and cyber cities, they provide so much opportunities. But without coming to the table and having some consensus on expectations, like financial services did, like medical did. So with the Attorney General's law here in California and the privacy laws that have been coming and leading, starting with Dana and her work, now create an entirely new opportunity for industry to come to the table and share the responsibility that you've had for the last 20-something years with FERPA. So it's really the first time. So for me, I'm so excited. I know I'm a little over-animated, but I'm so excited that it's finally happening. Education now has its sectorial moment. And really, I mean, I know it sounds a little overreaching, but it's actually because of the Attorney General's leadership around privacy in the United States. So you're part of such a great opportunity, and that you would come today and spend time with educators, it reflects their genuine desire for education community and ed tech to work together just like the other sectors. So anyway, that's my soapbox. I can